Hello and welcome to The Future Farmer in association with Carrs Billington, leading the industry through people, products and innovation. I'm Nick Wallis, and on each episode I'll be exploring an agricultural topic and discovering the technology that can help bring sustainable and profitable solutions to farming. From the science behind good silage to the efficient management of your milking systems. And here's a taster of what's to come in this episode.
Like any business, we have fixed costs like labour, power and machinery, etc. that we need to take into account as well. So it's trying to get the whole balance of that and the scale correct, that the fixed costs are met by the volume of milk produced over the year.
Today, it's all about balancing dairy diets, and we'll be finding out how we can bring about the most cost-effective performance from our dairy systems and from our cows. Talking us through this vital topic on the Future Farmer podcast is leading nutritionist and Chief Technical Officer for Carrs Billington, Jimmy Goldie.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Goldie. I'm the Chief Technical Officer for Carrs Billington. I work across the whole trading area for Carrs Billington and do technical support for the sales team on the ground, and very interested in the combination of the economics and nutrition on dairy farms to produce economic milk.
Jimmy, you grew up on a milk farm. Tell me a little bit about how the science of feed has changed over the years.
Yes, I did grow up in a dairy farm, and always had a particular interest in the scientific part of it. And it's interesting how it progresses, and I think the adaptation of that is just a better understanding of the cow and of the nutrition of the requirements of the cow, but also the feeds that go into that cow to produce healthy milk. And we look at that in a reasonable amount of detail, looking at the forage side of things, and also looking at the other feedstuffs that make up a particular diet.
It's not just quality in, quality out, is it? You have to see what the individual cow responds best to. You have to look at the milk yields. You have to look at the time of the season, what age the cow is at. There are so many different factors that come into it, and now feed appears to be examined at an almost molecular level. It presumably can be overwhelming for someone who's taking this on for the first time. How do you guide people through this?
Yeah, I think it's a particularly interesting subject, and you look at different farm systems that are in the UK. We've got some herds that are predominantly grazing herds, so probably calve in the spring, and then take the majority of their food from grazed grass. There's also other herds that will take more forage from conserved forage and maybe be housed for a longer part of the year, and it's trying to balance all of that and looking at the quality of forage that we have available on farm, be that grazed grass or conserved forage, and then what other feeds balance that to get the diet right. And as you say, it's taken into account a lot of things about the cow in terms of body weight, body condition, desired milk yield, milk quality. A number of the milk contracts, we get paid for milk quality in terms of butter, fat and protein, which is the important components, and we need to make sure that the diet is balanced particularly well to satisfy all these needs.
So what specific food groups does a dairy cow need in order to produce a good milk yield and stay healthy?
Well, if we start with forage, it's the main component. It's the cheapest food source on a dairy farm, whether that's grazed grass or conserved grass silage. And we spend a lot of time making that forage, as I say, most important component of the dairy diet. As a business, Carrs Billington carry out about 10,000 forage analysis per year. So we look at that and look at various different aspects of that forage. Firstly, dry matter to know how much food opposed to water is in that feed. And then we need to look at the energy and protein values, grass silage if it's conserved, if it's cut fairly early in the season, probably mid-May, we get good energy value measured as metabolizable energy. And then also the protein value of the forage is important. That usually ranges between 13 and 15%, and that is dependent on how the grass is growing and what nitrogen is applied to the ground and how that's utilised. That's been quite a challenge this season just because of the wet weather to start with and then the drought later on. So that has been a challenge in terms of monitoring protein levels in grass. And also for conserved forage, the fermentation process is very important, how that grass is is preserved. It's effectively a pickling process. So we want to have a lactic acid fermentation, and that can be quite variable depending on the weather, the season, the amount of sugar that's in the grass, and how that silage is fermented. But that's so important because we want it to last for 6 or 8 months over the winter so that it's available to feed. So we need to be able to understand how that silage is fermented, therefore the nutrient value of it in the diet.
So the forage can provide protein, energy, and roughage, but if it isn't at the right balance, what do you then have to think about? Do you think about supplements, buying in feed, and the economics of doing that?
Yeah, absolutely, because depending on the forage proportion, the easy assumption is that will make up 50% of the diet, but that will vary maybe from 40% up to 70%. But we then need to make up the rest of the diet with other feeds, depending on what the desired yield and milk quality is. So we can break that into sort of starch sources, so maize, wheat, barley as starch sources, sugar sources in terms of maybe sugar beet pulp or molasses, and then possibly a little bit of oil as well, so that we get a balance of nutrients no different from a human diet. And the same with protein sources, where for a cow we need rumen available protein and bypass protein, which is absorbed in the small intestine. We need to get the combination of that correct, so we get the right balance of diet. And we've got a long list of feeds available that we can use in the UK to balance that, many of which are actually byproducts rather than food that humans would eat. A lot of them are byproducts of other processes.
I've seen some of the websites, and you can go as deep into this as you like, but I came out thinking that you sometimes have to be a maths graduate rather than a farmer in order to get these calculations right. I guess that's where Carrs Billington can come in, because you can help simplify it and assess what a farmer needs to be feeding his dairy herd in order to make the yields right and keep the herd healthy.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time looking at the balance of that. We have a rationing program that we can feed the information into, looking at the different feedstuffs, what their nutrient values are, and then we can start looking at how we balance that correctly. So we spend a lot of time looking at the protein values in particular. So we need to look at the amount of rumen available protein, and also the sort of bypass or the protein that's digested in the small intestine. We look at the balance of that to try and give the appropriate amount of protein supply so that we get the right yield. But the energy is very important in that as well, because the energy is required to keep rumen function right, to get the protein digested properly, and getting that balance right is most important. We want to make sure we're not oversupplying protein and wasting it, so that's not good for the environment. So we spend a lot of time getting that balance called metabolizable protein, so it's the balance of energy and different types of protein, so we get it as efficient as possible.
Tell me about the economics of all this, because you need to be spending different amounts of money on different things for different herds or even individual cows at different times. And you've got to make sure that what you're feeding them doesn't cost more than you're going to get for your milk yield. So explain to me how the economic thinking feeds into what your calculations are when you're talking to farmers about what to give their dairy herd.
Yeah, absolutely. Economics are very important in terms of starting off, obviously, with milk price. There's a variety of milk prices achieved across farms, depending on milk quality, depending on milk company, depends on the route for that milk, and from the consumer point of view. So we start off with milk price, and then looking at how we can produce that milk most efficiently. And we've got the forage and feed inputs to start with, and we look at the response to that. I tend to look at the margin over feed per cow rather than per litre, because I want to get the best margin per cow. So that's looking at getting the forage and concentrate values balanced so that we can get a good healthy yield of milk, but not overspending in feed. And we can then look at the different types of feed to make sure that that's got an efficient cost as possible. You've then got other costs incurred on farm, be that vet and medicine or other fertiliser costs that are used to grow the crop. And then, like any business, we have fixed costs like labour, power and machinery, etc., that we need to take into account as well. So it's trying to get the whole balance of that and the scale correct, that the fixed costs are met by the volume of milk produced over the year.
I mean, you talk about balancing. It sounds almost like juggling, and obviously efficiencies come into how much time you can actually spend on this before it starts to not become cost effective. Do you have any rules of thumb when it comes to dairy herds and what they need and how and starting points?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's always the way to start. You've got to look at the get the basics right first. So we need usually a minimum of 50% of the diet coming from forage. That's most important. We're then looking at a feed rate of probably 0.3 to 0.35 kilograms per litre. So that feed rate is important to get the correct yield, but within an economic balance as well. We then want to look at some of the health aspects of the cow as well, because we want that milk to be produced with the cow still remaining healthy. And so rumen function is very important. So if we put too much starch into the diet, we might end up lowering the pH of the rumen, and we'll end up with acidosis, which can cause a bit of problems. So we need to monitor cow performance quite regularly and make sure that the cow, the rumen is healthy. If the rumen's healthy, then we're more likely to get economic and efficient milk production.
It sounds very much like a collaborative process with the farmer. Tell me how Carrs Billington work with individual farmers to achieve the optimum results for their particular herds.
Absolutely, it's very much a joint effort in that sense, that the forage is very much the responsibility of the farmer to make the quality forage. We need to understand what that is on the farm to start with, and then we discuss what the farm needs are in terms of what the desired yield is, what the farm system is. We need to understand that first before we can give put the right balance of diet together, and then that's done under discussion to make sure we get that bit of it correct for the cow and the farmer. We then monitor that quite closely to make sure we look at milk quality, we look at yield on a regular basis. We also need to look at body condition of the cow to make sure that the cow's not losing excess weight or gaining excess weight. And also fertility is very important as well, to make sure that cow is in a healthy state, that it will be fertile and produce another calf the following year. So we also do something called cow signals, which is looking at the whole farm system and look at any areas that are any sort of pinch points in terms of feed and water access and supply, ventilation, different aspects to make sure that these cows are looked after in the most optimal way.
Describe to me the requirements when it comes to water supply and ventilation, because we focus quite a lot on nutrition. Why is the water supply and ventilation so important?
From a healthy point of view, a cow needs fresh air, the same as we do. Cow produces quite a lot of body heat. So if you have 100 cows in a building, then we need to manage that excess heat. So the ventilation of the building is very, very important to make sure the cow is kept reasonably cool and it has fresh air to breathe. And the same with water. No different from humans, water is a very important resource in terms of milk production, bearing in mind that milk is 88% water. So the cows require a significant amount of water in a day. So we need to make sure that there's plenty of access to good, clean, fresh water.
We were talking in a previous podcast about the different milking systems, particularly the growing interest in robotic milking systems. Does the method of milking affect the diet that a particular cow is on, or should it affect it?
It affects it more in the sense that the frequency of milking as well. The more often that a cow is milked, the cow will respond to that as it would if it was producing milk for its offspring. So if the calf, the offspring, was demanding more milk from that cow, then it would naturally produce more milk. So if the milking frequency is increased, so if on a standard system it's usually twice a day that cows are milked, on some occasions farmers will milk 3 times a day, and in a robotic system an individual cow can be milked 4 or 5 times a day. So the demand on that cow, the milk will then produce more milk. And if we produce more milk, we then need to make sure that cow has enough nutrition to allow that cow to have a sustained milk yield to that level.
Of the conversations that you're having with the farmers that you meet on a regular basis, what are the issues within the industry that you find yourself being asked about the most?
Economics are always at the forefront. Milk prices are always very important in terms of the viability of businesses. So that varies across the industry depending on the milk company. So that is always a point of discussion in terms of making sure that farmers can stay within an economic level depending on what milk price is. We then need to look at how that affects on farm, that we want to always have enough forage on farm. So forage production, especially this year in a year of drought, that's been a main discussion point to make sure that we always have enough stock of feed to look after the cows. Environmental pressures are always a discussion point as well, whether that's the carbon footprint of a dairy farm or the greenhouse gas emissions, methane and ammonia emissions is always a topic of conversation as well. And it's something that farmers are getting more and more aware of and looking looking at just how their efficient farming can make sure that we get the best of both, in terms of we can still produce lots of food for us to eat, but also to do that in a sustainable and environmental way as possible.
Is there a trade-off when farmers say to you, look, I want to reduce my environmental footprint? Do you say, well, okay, we can switch to a different sort of feed, but it is going to affect your milk yield? Or are there new formulations coming in down the line or here already which can reduce the environmental footprint of a dairy herd but still continue to produce that high level of milk yield?
Yeah, a combination of all of that, and like always, there's a compromise somewhere or other, and we need to look at it in terms of the efficiency on farm, and that comes under a number of different aspects, in terms of, for example, young stock at the age that dairy heifers are calved at. If they can be calved at 2 years old rather than 2.5 years old, that reduces the carbon footprint of the overall farm business. And then from an individual cow point of view, looking at how efficiently we can get the milk yield produced is helping as well. So the higher quality feeds that we put in, the more efficient that becomes. And also we spend quite a bit of time looking at the protein balance again. And if we can reduce the amount of protein that we feed, but feed it in a slightly different way so that the type of protein and the balance of that is better. Carrs Billington have a product called AminoMax, which is a heat protected soya, which allows us to put a small amount of bypass protein into the cow and actually reduce the total amount of protein that we feed, and still maintain the milk yield. And that's something we've spent quite a bit of time researching and looking at on farm, to make sure that we keep a bit of everything, in terms of we can still achieve good milk yields, but we're doing it as an environmental way as possible.
So what do you see coming down the line in the next few years? Where are the big advances going to happen? Is it going to be in better understanding the way cows digest their forage, or is it going to be in better synthesized, or perhaps using different food sources to create more nutritious or more efficient food? What are you starting to see that is a really interesting area for you?
Yeah, I think just the overall balance of these diets, and looking, as you say, different feedstuffs as well. Soya is under question at the minute in terms of whether that's an efficient food source, but we need to look at different sources of protein and how that is fed, how that's digested by the cow, to make sure that that's as efficient as possible, and whether we have any other additives that help that rumen efficiency. We use an additive called Tectonic, which helps the sort of rumen digestion, and it's a natural product, and that's something that's quite important to make sure that the rumen function is then kept as efficient as possible without minimising waste, really.
If it's not going to be soya, what is it going to be?
Well, that's an interesting question in terms of whether it's rapeseed meal or distiller's byproduct, but the protein profile of these are not actually quite as good as soya. So soya, when you look at it from a carbon footprint point of view and the cow efficiency, soya is actually quite a good feed. So if we can use less soya but balance it better, then that is still a good way of doing it.
Where do you see the regulatory push? What's the direction of travel in that? What are you starting to hear about the ways that dairy farms will be asked to move in the direction of by it's not going to be European authorities anymore, is it? It's going to be the British authority.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things, and a lot of the legislation that we'll see is not particularly new, but I think it'll get tightened up in terms of animal welfare and environmental, and many farms are already well aware of these, but it's how these are monitored and controlled over the coming months and years, and looking at just how we make sure that cows are kept in a good conditions, that their welfare is maintained very highly. As you can see in many farms, the welfare of the animals is good, and it's trying to couple that with the efficiency on farm, which actually has that environmental benefit as well, and a number of the processors and supermarkets already monitoring that on farm and looking at how they can improve the environmental footprint of a dairy farm.
One thing that we haven't touched on yet is the vitamin and mineral supply to cows in their feed. Again, what would you advise farmers on what they need to be looking out for when they're thinking about that?
Yeah, vitamins and minerals are very important, no different from what they are to humans. We need a variety of vitamins and minerals on a daily basis to just function generally, and that obviously helps cows to produce milk as well. So we get minerals and vitamins from background levels from feeds that we eat, that the cows eat, supply some vitamins and minerals, but they don't always supply the full complement of what's required. So we have to add in a supplement, again, no different from a human supplement. We need to add in some vitamins and minerals to make sure that the cow is fully supplied. So, for example, milk is high in calcium. So calcium is one of the most important minerals we need to supply to make sure the cow has enough to then produce milk. And there's other vitamins and minerals we need to supply that are shortfall in the feedstuffs. But we also have to be careful we don't oversupply minerals as well. Copper in particular, we've come across a few issues with copper toxicity, where copper levels have built up in the cows and cause toxic levels. So we have to have a careful balance. Our compound feeds are mineralised carefully to make sure they supply sufficient minerals, but not too much. We've reduced the levels in some of our minerals already. And we can also add a mineral supplement into the forage that's being fed as well to make up any shortfall of minerals that the animals require.
And standing back a bit, I mean, we've done a tiny bit of futurology, but just looking at the industry as a whole, do you see the dairy industry in the UK as being healthy, as being in need of any particular support in any particular area, or is the future looking bright?
I think it's getting the balance between what the consumer wants and it's been interesting with COVID-19, just the change in behaviour of how people eat and drink, and that we need to understand that. Then what the processing capacity is in the UK, which is important as well, and that's quite a fine balance. If we increase milk production, then the processing capacity within the country can be under question, and we then need to balance that between the economics on farm in terms of farm scale. Too small possibly isn't sufficient, but equally we need to be careful that too large, we lose control of certain things as well. So there's a balance there too in terms of making sure that we have a healthy industry. Over the last 20, 30 years, yield per cow has increased, so the number of cows in the country is less from what we used to have, and the same, the number of farms and dairy farms in the UK is less than what it was in the past. It declines each year, but we need to make sure that's a healthy number of farms and cows that we can produce milk efficiently and economically.
And when you talk about a healthy number of farms, do you also mean in terms of scale? Because I understand the problems that might arise if smaller farms can't scale up, but you nearly touched on what happens if farms become too large. What are the dangers there? Do you think we need a spread of small, medium-sized and large dairy farms in the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. We can see some very efficient family farms in the UK that may be 150 cows per herd, and that works particularly well. So the fixed costs of that business, labour, power, machinery, etc., can be very well balanced. Obviously, scale can be useful in terms of overall output and getting the efficiency of scale, but the attention to detail needs to be good to make sure that everything is run appropriately, and labour can be an issue, the same as in many other industries, is getting skilled labour as farms scale up to make sure that we can still look after the cows sufficiently.
Given how much more efficient dairy farms are becoming, is oversupply likely to be an issue? Is that what you were touching on when you talked about the processing capacity in the UK?
Yeah, well, interestingly, a few years back we had European milk quotas. They were introduced in 1984 and they controlled production across Europe. So therefore we couldn't produce more milk than the market allowed, or what the European legislation allowed. They were removed a few years ago, so that is no longer the case, and milk production has increased a little bit, but we need to balance that with consumer consumption in terms of milk and dairy products. And again, that depends on consumer behaviour, whether we all want to bake cakes and use lots of butter, or whether we want our cafe latte in the morning. So that is essential that balance is made, rather than us just producing milk and not understanding the market at the other end.
Well, we started off with the micro and we went to the macro, and Jimmy, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and your encyclopedic knowledge of this industry is quite inspiring. So thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, that's it. Thanks for listening to the Future Farmer podcast in association with Carrs Billington. For more information about some of the issues discussed in this episode, search for the Carrs Billington website. Once there, you can email with your inquiry, or if you have a question about feeds, machineries, agricultural and rural supplies, or fuels, there are Carrs Billington experts on the other end of the phone. Listen out for future episodes, And don't forget to like and subscribe so we know if we're answering all your questions. I'm Nick Wallis, and until next time, keep safe and keep farming.